What would you do if your wife stepped out of the shower smiling, denied everything with perfect calm, and you realized the real proof wasn't a confession at all, but the single thing she froze over when she saw it on the counter? My name is Daniel Ward, and I learned a long time ago that truth rarely arrives with fireworks, because it usually shows up like a quiet bill you forgot you owed. I was standing in our bedroom with a clean towel in my hands, pretending I was just a husband in a normal house on a normal morning, when Lena stepped out of the shower and filled the room with steam and citrus shampoo. She looked calm in a way that did not match the last 3 weeks, calm in the way a person looks when they already rehearsed the ending in their head and decided you will not like it. Her hair was wrapped tight, her skin still flushed from heat, and she had that small smile people wear when they think they are ahead of you by a mile. I did not raise my voice because I was not here to win an argument, and I was not here to beg for scraps of honesty from someone who treated honesty like an optional subscription. I asked her very plainly how long it had been going on, and I watched the smile stay on her mouth while her eyes made a quick, hungry check of the counter. She asked what I meant, with the kind of innocence that always feels like an insult when you have been married long enough to know the difference between confusion and performance. I said I hoped he was worth it, and for half a second her face held the exact expression you see right before a mask slips, a tight little pause where the brain is counting angles and exits. Then her attention snapped to the phone lying on the bathroom tile, face up, the screen dark, the case still damp from the humidity. I did not touch it, because touching it would turn my clean question into a messy crime scene, and I did not need illegal access or heroic tricks or any of that fantasy garbage people use to justify their lack of patience. I had built my career on patience, on patterns, on small, ordinary proofs that survive sunlight, and I was not going to start behaving like a desperate man just because my wife decided to play games. Lena dried off like nothing was happening, and that was the first real clue I had, because guilt does not always cry, and sometimes it simply keeps moving, as if motion will drown the sound of consequences. She wrapped the towel around herself and walked past me with a slow confidence that felt practiced, like she wanted my reaction more than she wanted my forgiveness. I stood there and let her pass, not because I was weak, but because I was done giving her emotional leverage as a form of entertainment. I watched her pick up the phone, and I saw the smallest tremor in her fingers, the kind of micro-error you get when the body betrays the story. She angled the screen away from me, too casually, like a magician who believes the audience is stupid, and she said she was late and needed to get dressed. It was not the words that mattered, because words were cheap in our house lately. It was the choreography, the new instincts, the way she moved as if our shared life had become a hallway she no longer wanted to be seen in. When she left the bathroom, the steam slowly cleared, and the mirror showed my face, like it belonged to a stranger who had forgotten to blink. I did not punch a wall, and I did not shout, and I did not make some dramatic threat that would become her next story at brunch. I washed my hands, because it gave me something simple to do, and because I wanted to feel clean while I made my next decision. I looked at the counter, and I noticed a tiny detail that would have meant nothing yesterday, the faint smear of water where her phone had been sitting, as if it had been placed down quickly and picked up even faster. That kind of detail is not proof of anything, but it is a signal, and signals are how every good case begins. The worst lies are never complicated. They are just repeated often enough to feel like furniture. Lena's public life was charity work, donor dinners, planning meetings, smiling photos, and long messages full of gratitude that never felt like hers when I read them over her shoulder. She ran a local charity that fed the right kind of people at the right kind of tables, and in that world, reputation is currency, and the people who manage it learn to spend it with the cold precision of bankers. For a long time, I had been proud of her, and I had been proud of us, because we looked like a couple who knew how to hold the line. Lately, we looked like a couple who knew how to take pictures. It is amazing how fast a marriage can go from partnership to brand, and how quickly your home starts to feel like a set where you are only welcome when you play your role correctly. I went into the kitchen and made coffee, because routine is not just comfort, it is camouflage. I set my phone on the counter, and I opened the notes app I used for work, the one that kept my mind tidy when other people's mess tried to crawl into it. I work as an insurance adjuster, which means I spend my days sorting truth from theater, and I have learned to respect boring documentation more than passionate speeches. I created a new note and titled it with a date, because that is how you start an evidence ledger without turning your life into a cheap spy movie. I wrote one sentence. Lena denied the question, looked at the phone, then changed the subject. I added the time, because time is a knife that cuts through stories if you hold it steady. The first rule I gave myself was simple, and it was the rule that would keep me sane. I would not accuse her in public, I would not chase rumors, and I would not act on anything I could not support. I would build the truth out of small, lawful pieces, and I would let the weight of those pieces crush whatever structure she was building around herself. I have seen people lie their way through car accidents, water damage, theft claims, and even their own medical injuries, and they all make the same mistake. They believe the lie has to be dramatic to be convincing, so they overproduce it. They add too many details, and they forget that the real world runs on receipts, schedules, and timestamps. When someone is lying, the story grows, but reality stays the same shape, and that mismatch is where you find them. Lena came into the kitchen dressed for the day, hair still damp, perfume already on, smile back in place. She kissed my cheek like we were fine, and the kiss landed like a stamped envelope with no return address. She talked about a meeting, about a volunteer issue, about being swamped, and she said it all with the polite speed of someone who does not want questions. I nodded, because nodding costs nothing, and I did not give her the satisfaction of watching me break. She picked up her coffee travel mug, and I saw her glance at my phone, quick and sharp, checking if I was watching her, checking if I was writing anything down. That glance told me more than any confession would have. People who are innocent do not monitor your hands. After she left, the house went quiet, and quiet is dangerous when you are full of thoughts that want to turn into rage. I sat at the table with my coffee and stared at the empty chair across from me, the chair that used to feel like a shared place and now felt like a witness stand. I did not call her, and I did not send her a message demanding clarity because that would feed her. Instead, I opened our shared calendar on my laptop, the one we used for normal couple things like appointments, birthdays, and dinner plans. I did not dig through private accounts, and I did not try to guess passwords because I did not need to. I only needed to look at what was already in my line of sight, and I needed to remember that if she was cheating, she would still be living inside a routine, even if she was trying to disguise it as work. The calendar looked ordinary at first, but ordinary is how rot hides. There were blocks labeled meeting, event prep, donor call, and volunteer planning, and none of it was surprising for her job. Still, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten, and it was the kind of detail you only notice when you stop trusting the person who wrote it. Some entries were vague in a way that felt defensive, like meeting instead of a name, like event run instead of a location. People who are honest tend to overshare boring details because they do not fear their own schedule, and people who are hiding something tend to sand the edges down until everything looks the same. A schedule with no texture is not efficient, it is convenient. I printed nothing, saved nothing, and clicked nothing that would leave an obvious trail because I was not trying to play ninja. I just looked, and I wrote down what I saw like I would for any claim file. Repeated late blocks, vague labels, and changes that appeared at odd times. Then I closed the laptop and forced myself to breathe, because the urge to confront is always strongest when the truth is still foggy. I have watched enough people ruin their own cases by moving too early, and I was not going to become one of them. That afternoon, I went to work and acted normal, because the world does not stop spinning just because your marriage starts slipping off its axis. I took calls, reviewed photos, and listened to people explain why their accidents were never their fault. The irony was not lost on me, but I did not laugh because I was too busy thinking about the way Lena looked at that phone. My mind kept replaying that tiny pause after my question, that micro freeze before she recovered, and it made me realize something I had not wanted to admit. She was not shocked that I suspected. She was shocked that I was calm. She had prepared for anger, for pleading, for some messy, dramatic scene she could use later, and my calm was a problem she had not solved yet. When I got home, Lena was already there, moving through the house with that same practiced ease, as if our morning conversation had never happened. She asked about my day, offered dinner, and said she might have to step out later for a quick charity issue. She said it casually, like a person describing a grocery run, but her eyes kept checking me, and her body kept angling toward the hallway as if she wanted space between us. I watched her hands as she spoke, because hands do not lie as well as mouths, and her fingers kept touching her phone like it was a lucky charm. Every time the screen buzzed, she would glance down, then look back up with a smile that did not reach her eyes. If I had been a younger man, I might have exploded right then, and she would have worn that explosion like armor. Instead, I asked her what time she would be back, and I listened to the answer like it mattered. Later, while she was in the shower again, the phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, and the screen lit for just a moment. I was in the hallway, and I did not step into the bathroom, and I did not pick it up, and I did not do anything that could be called snooping. I simply saw what any person standing in my own home could see, a short lock screen preview that flashed 2 words that did not belong to any charity task. It was the kind of phrasing you see when someone is being collected, when someone is being transported, when someone is living a second schedule inside your first. The screen went dark again, and the steam rolled out into the hallway like a warning. I walked into the kitchen, opened my notes app, and wrote the time down with a steadiness that surprised even me. I did not know the full story yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity, and it settled in my chest like cold metal. Lena was not just cheating, she was managing it, polishing it, and packaging it like a side project she thought she deserved. And now she had made the mistake every careful liar eventually makes. She had brought the lie into my house, lit it up on a screen, and assumed I would be too emotional to take a simple timestamp seriously. That night, she came to bed with damp hair and soft words, and she acted like intimacy could erase suspicion if she performed it correctly. I lay there beside her and stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathing settle into the calm rhythm of someone who believes the danger has passed. I kept my face neutral because I was done begging for the truth, and I was done chasing her story around the room. In my head, I saw the shape of the next 30 days, and it was not a fight, and it was not a dramatic showdown in the living room. It was a slow collapse, built on tiny lawful facts, stacked carefully until there was nowhere left for her to stand. In the dark, my phone vibrated once with a merchant alert from my card, a charge that should not have existed from a place Lena had never mentioned, and I did not move at first. I simply let the screen glow, and I let the truth arrive the way it always does when it is patient, through a name, a number, and a time. I woke up before Lena, not because I slept well, but because my body had decided sleep was a luxury it could no longer afford. The room still smelled faintly of her shampoo, and the air felt heavy with the kind of peace that only exists when one person believes the story is finished. Lena lay on her side with her phone face down on the nightstand, and the simple fact of it, the way she had started hiding the screen like it was a secret diary, made my chest tighten in a way I refused to show. I slid out of bed quietly, went to the kitchen, and made coffee with the same measured motions I used at work when I was trying not to let a client's panic infect my hands. Routine was not denial, it was control, and control was the only thing I had left that felt like mine. On the counter, my phone sat where I had left it, and the screen still held the merchant alert from the night before. I did not need to invent meaning, because it already had meaning, and all I had to do was treat it like a claim file. The alert showed a charge on my card from a place Lena had never said out loud, a place that was not a grocery store, not a pharmacy, not a gas station, not a charity vendor I recognized from her normal work. It was a hotel lobby bar, one of those polished places where people sit under low light and pretend their choices are elegant just because the glassware is expensive. The time on the alert was just after 10, which was the same window she had called a quick charity issue and left the house with her hair still damp. I stared at the details until the anger tried to rise, then I pressed it back down because anger was loud, and loud was the terrain she knew how to weaponize. I opened my notes and created a new line under yesterday's entry, and I wrote the date, the merchant name, and the exact time. I did not add accusations, because a ledger is not a diary, and I did not add feelings, because feelings do not hold up when someone tries to rewrite you into a villain. I added one more line. Lena said she had a charity issue. The charge suggests a hotel lobby bar. I stared at that clean sequence and felt a strange relief, because reality had finally offered me something solid, and solid things are easier to carry than doubts. Doubts make you paranoid, but facts make you quiet. When Lena came into the kitchen, she wore a soft sweater and a calm expression, the kind of look that suggested she had forgiven me for questioning her, as if suspicion had been my flaw and not her behavior. She kissed my cheek again, and this time I noticed how her eyes stayed half open during it, monitoring my posture like she was studying an opponent. She poured herself coffee, glanced at my phone, then looked away too fast, and she asked if I had slept well. I told her I slept fine because I was not going to use my mouth as a weapon. She said she had a busy day, and that tonight there was a small planning meet for an upcoming charity event. Nothing big, just details with vendors, and she said it in that same vague way that kept the shape of her schedule smooth and untraceable. I nodded, and I made myself look bored, because nothing makes a liar more nervous than boredom. After she left for the day, I did not sit around staring at calendars like a man in a cheap drama. I went to work, did my job, and let my brain chew on the details in the background the way it always did when I was building a case. People think investigating is a sprint, but it is usually a slow walk through ordinary places, collecting small crumbs that add up to a meal no one wants to eat. I handled claims, listened to stories, and kept thinking about that hotel bar charge. The most important question was not who, not yet, but how she was paying, and why she felt safe using my card. That detail told me either she was careless, or she believed I was too distracted, too trusting, or too afraid to look. None of those options made me feel generous. That evening, I stopped at a grocery store on my way home, bought dinner supplies, and asked the cashier for a receipt copy that showed the time. It was a normal request, the kind of thing people ask for every day, and she printed it without a second glance. In the parking lot, I took a photo of that receipt beside the date label I kept in my glove compartment for work notes, not because the grocery receipt was evidence of cheating, but because it established my own timeline with a clean reference point. If Lena ever tried to claim I was stalking her or that I was spiraling, I wanted my own movements documented, calm and ordinary, so her future narrative would have something solid to crash into. I was not building a case only against her affair. I was building a case against the story she might tell about me. At home, Lena was already there, moving through the kitchen like nothing had changed. She asked about my day, asked what I wanted for dinner, and smiled the way she used to smile when she still believed we were on the same side. I watched her while I cooked, and I noticed the subtle shifts, how she kept her phone close, how she angled the screen away, how she laughed a little too brightly at nothing. I asked in a flat tone what time her planning meet was. She said around 8, but it might run late, and she said it was with a vendor team, so they would probably talk at a quiet place. I asked which vendor, and she answered with a vague description instead of a name, which was the kind of dodge that always appears when someone is trying not to create a trail. When she went upstairs to change, I cleaned the kitchen and opened our shared calendar on my laptop again, only to view it, not to dig, not to pry, just to look at what we had always shared. The calendar entry for tonight was labeled planning meet, with no location and no names. I stared at it and felt the shape of the lie, smooth and empty like a polished stone. Then I did something I had avoided the day before, because now the pattern was stronger. I exported the week view as a PDF, not because it was forbidden, but because it was mine as much as hers, and because shared means shared until someone tries to pretend it never did. The PDF captured the entry exactly as it was at that moment, and it gave me a stable snapshot of her official story. If she edited it later, that change itself would become a signal. I saved the PDF to a folder on my laptop labeled Household, and I did not put it in a cloud, and I did not send it anywhere, and I did not tell anyone, because this was still my home, and I was not going to invite an audience until I had something worth showing. I wrote the action in my ledger, exported shared calendar week view at 6:42 p.m. I signed the back of the printed copy I made at work the next day, because signatures are simple, and simple things survive. Lena came downstairs looking polished, dressed like someone who was going to be seen, not like someone who was going to talk about napkin colors and seating logistics. She wore a coat that felt too expensive for a simple planning meet, and she had that careful glow people get when they are about to step into a second life they think they deserve. She kissed me, said she would be back soon, and left with a confident pace that was supposed to look normal. As soon as the door shut, I felt the urge to follow her, to drive behind her, to catch her in the act like some jealous husband in a movie, but I refused, because following her would not build my case. It would build her defense. If she saw me, she would turn the story into harassment, and if she did not see me, I would still be a man hiding in a car, and that was not who I wanted to become. Instead, I stayed home and waited, because waiting is what you do when you are collecting facts. I did laundry, answered emails, and checked my phone alerts the way I would check a file for updates. At 9:58 p.m., another merchant notification appeared, and my stomach tightened before my brain even processed the details. It was the same hotel lobby bar, the same polished merchant name, and the amount was not huge, but it was large enough to be a night that included two people pretending they were alone in the world. I did not need to imagine the scene, because imagination is where people lose control. I needed only the time, the place, and the confirmation that the pattern was real. I wrote it down immediately, exact time included, and then I sat at the kitchen table and let the quiet stretch. The house was still, and the stillness made me hear every small sound, the refrigerator hum, the heating vent, the faint tick of the clock that Lena had bought at an antique shop because she liked how it looked in photos. I stared at that clock and thought about how many times she had said she was doing charity work while she was actually building something else. I thought about how often I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because trust is supposed to be the default in a marriage. Trust is how people build lives without turning them into court cases, and Lena had apparently decided she wanted the benefits of trust, while she acted as if trust was for fools. She came home after 11, moving quietly, like she hoped I would be asleep. When she stepped into the kitchen, she froze for a moment, because I was sitting at the table with a glass of water and my phone beside it. I did not look angry, and I did not look hurt, and that seemed to confuse her more than any accusation would have. She asked why I was up, and I said I had some work files on my mind. She told me the planning meet ran late, and she added a small complaint about how hard it was to coordinate volunteers, the kind of filler detail people use to make lies feel lived in. I nodded and asked her what time she left the meet. She gave me a time that did not match the merchant alert window, and she did not realize I had already written the actual time down. I did not call her out because I was not done. Instead, I asked if she had eaten, and she said she had a small bite at the meat, nothing fancy, and she smiled as if she had passed a test. I watched her walk upstairs, and I heard the shower turn on again, and I realized she was washing the night off her skin the way someone washes off guilt. The sound of the water filled the house, and it made me think about that first moment in the bathroom, the steam, the smile, the way she had looked at her phone like it could save her. It was not the lover that haunted me in that moment. It was the certainty that she believed she could keep doing this because she believed I would never move from suspicion to structure. When she came back downstairs to grab something, her phone buzzed, and the screen lit up just enough for me to catch a preview without moving from my chair. It was only a fragment, but it was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. It was the kind of message that assumes privacy, the kind of casual prompt that says, in a few words, that a plan is ongoing and shared. Lena saw my eyes flick toward the screen, and her hand moved fast, too fast, and she slipped the phone into her pocket like it was a weapon she needed to hide. She smiled again, but this time the smile had stress in it, like the corners were being held up by muscle instead of confidence. I waited until she went back upstairs, and then I opened my ledger and wrote one more line, the cleanest line of the night. Lock screen preview at 11:17 p.m. Language suggests coordinated pickup or drop-off. I added the note that I never touched her phone because one day that detail might matter. Then I sat back and listened to the house settle. In the dark, I could feel the story shifting because Lena's lies were no longer floating in the air. They were landing on paper, attached to times and places that did not care how charming she looked in the morning. I went to bed after midnight, not because I felt peaceful, but because I needed tomorrow to come with a clear head. As I lay beside her, I made myself a quiet promise, one that did not require threats or tears. I would collect enough small truths to collapse her scaffolding, and I would do it without breaking the rules, without giving her a villain to point at, and without giving her the satisfaction of watching me lose control. The next day, I would take the first piece of evidence that could not be argued as a feeling, and I would make it stand on its own. By the third morning, the anger had settled into something colder, like a bruise that stops throbbing and starts reminding you it exists every time you move. Lena acted normal in the way people act normal when they are lying, which means they do not act normal at all. They act like they are on stage and worried the lights might flicker. She made breakfast, asked about my day, and touched my arm with a softness that felt timed, not felt. And I watched the performance with the same patience I used when a claimant told me their flooded basement definitely came from mysterious rain, while their new aquarium sat proudly in the corner. Lena was not trying to fix us, she was trying to manage me, and management is not love, it is risk control. I did not bring up the hotel bar charge at breakfast, and I did not bring up the late-night messages, and I did not bring up the way her schedule had turned into vague blocks of fog. I let her talk, because talk is where people hang themselves, and I had decided that my job now was to keep my hands clean and my mind sharper than her story. She mentioned a volunteer planning session again, the same word choice she kept using, as if repeating it could make it true, and she said there might be a quick stop at the charity office later because a vendor needed answers. She said, vendor with no name, because names create trails and trails create consequences. I nodded, washed my coffee mug, and watched her eyes track my phone like she expected me to lunge at it and prove her future claim that I was unstable. After she left, the house felt quieter than usual, and I realized the quiet was not peace. It was the sound of my life shrinking into a file. I opened a drawer in the kitchen where we kept old chargers and spare keys, and I pulled out the shared tablet we used for recipes, streaming, and occasionally checking the family calendar during dinner. The tablet was logged into the same account Lena used for some of her apps, because couples do that when they trust each other, and because trust is supposed to be safe. I did not guess passwords, and I did not bypass locks, and I did not do anything illegal or clever. I simply powered it on and left it on the counter, face up, where it had always lived. Because if a device is shared, then what appears on it is not a secret. It is a mistake waiting to happen. I moved around the kitchen and let time pass like bait on a hook. 10 minutes later, the tablet chimed softly, and a notification banner slid across the top of the screen, short enough to be a preview, sharp enough to be a confession in disguise. It used the same casual language I had seen on Lena's lock screen, the kind that assumes the world is private and the husband is sleeping, and it included a pickup reference that did not belong to charity work or volunteer planning. I did not touch any message thread, and I did not open anything. I only did what any person does when a screen shows them something they may need later. I took a screenshot on the shared tablet, the most boring act in the world, and then I opened my notes ledger and wrote the exact time the notification appeared, because time is not emotional and it cannot be argued with. The relief I felt was quick and ugly because it came with a new certainty, and certainty is a heavy thing when the truth is unpleasant. I named the screenshot file with the date and time, then I put it in a plain folder on my laptop, because I was not building a revenge fantasy, I was building a record. The difference matters, because fantasies want applause and records want silence. I printed a copy at work later that day, signed the back, and slipped it into a clear sleeve like I would for any document that might need to survive a liar's tantrum. It felt clinical, and it felt necessary, and it reminded me that my wife had turned our marriage into a situation where paperwork was safer than conversation. At lunch, I got a message from my cousin asking if everything was okay with Lena, because Lena had posted something vague about stress and needing boundaries, and people love vague posts because they let them pretend they are wise while they build a soft crowd around themselves. I told my cousin we were fine, because I was not going to fight Lena on the same battlefield where she was already planting flags. Still, the message told me something important. Lena was not just cheating, she was shaping the story around the cheating, and she was doing it early before the truth could catch her. That kind of pre-framing is not accidental, it is strategy, and it usually means the person expects an explosion and wants witnesses ready to blame the smoke. That afternoon, I left work a little early and stopped by a small cafe near the charity office, not because I planned to follow Lena, but because I wanted to understand the public world she moved through when she was not home. The cafe was the kind of place where people recognize each other by jackets and coffee orders, and where gossip travels in polite whispers that sound like concern. I sat in a corner with my laptop open to a blank document, so I looked like any other working adult, and I watched who came and went. 10 minutes later, I saw the charity volunteer coordinator, a woman I had met once at a fundraiser, walk in, looking tired and annoyed. I did not ambush her, and I did not ask her about Lena's love life like some desperate man begging for scraps. I simply nodded, exchanged a few polite words, and mentioned I hoped the planning sessions were not too chaotic lately. The coordinator gave me the kind of look people give when they are tired of pretending everything is fine, and she said the committee session had been canceled last minute because of a vendor scheduling issue, which was strange because Lena had described it as a crucial meet that ran late and required her presence. I did not argue, and I did not react like I had caught a fish. I asked a simple clarifying question about the date, then I thanked her and let her go. When she left, I opened my ledger and wrote down what she said in one clean line, including the coordinator's first name and the time of the conversation. It was not a sworn statement, and it was not courtroom drama, but it was something that could be confirmed later, and confirmation is the spine of every good collapse. That evening, Lena came home and acted tired, the way someone acts tired when they want sympathy as a shield. She told me the planning session had been a disaster, full of delays, and she said they had to relocate to a quiet place to finish the details because it was hard to think in the charity office. She delivered the lie with enough texture to sound believable, and that was the second clue of the day because liars get more detailed when they sense risk. I did not challenge her. I asked which vendor had caused the delay, and she answered with another vague description that carefully avoided a name. I asked what time she left the office, and she gave a number that did not match the time on the notification screenshot. She smiled after she answered, like she was proud of how smoothly she had spoken. I smiled back, because I have watched people lie about far less with far more confidence, and they always think the performance is what matters. After dinner, Lena went upstairs to take a call, and I stayed in the living room with the shared tablet on my lap, pretending to scroll through a recipe site. Another notification banner appeared, short and careless, and it contained the kind of word that does not belong in a professional vendor conversation. I took another screenshot, not because I needed to drown in proof, but because two consistent previews establish a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss as misunderstandings. I wrote the exact time down again, and I added a note about the wording, because wording is where rehearsal shows. Then I powered off the tablet and put it away, because I refused to become the kind of person who spends all night waiting for a screen to blink. The next step was to connect the digital crumbs to something physical, because physical evidence has a gravity that social talk cannot fake. I did not rummage through Lena's private drawers, but I did normal household things that naturally put my hands near normal household objects. I took out the trash, sorted the recycling, and cleaned the hallway table where Lena dumped her keys and receipts like she believed the universe was her assistant. In the recycling bin, under a stack of glossy charity mailers, I found a small receipt strip, folded twice, the way people fold a receipt when they want it gone, but cannot bring themselves to throw it away immediately. It was from the same hotel bar merchant name I had seen in my alerts, and the time on it matched the late window she had described as volunteer chaos. I held it between two fingers like it was contaminated, not because it was dangerous, but because it proved how casually she had brought the lie into our home. I set the receipt on the kitchen counter beside that day's newspaper, because the newspaper date was a simple anchor, and I took a photo of the receipt with the date visible. I did not crop it, and I did not edit it, and I did not dramatize it. I simply captured it as it was. Then I stapled a printed copy into my growing evidence sleeve stack with a handwritten label: hotel bar receipt found in recycling, date and time visible. I wrote the action in my ledger, because a case is not only about the evidence, it is about the chain of how you got it. I knew Lena would try to claim I forged things, or staged things, or obsessed over things. I wanted my record to show the opposite, a calm sequence of normal discoveries in a shared home. When Lena came back downstairs, she saw the receipt photo printed near my laptop, not waved in her face, not used as a weapon, just there like an object that happened to exist. Her expression tightened in a way she could not control, and for a moment she stared at it as if the paper itself had insulted her. She asked what it was, and I told her it was a receipt I found while cleaning, and I watched her decide which version of herself to wear. She tried a laugh first, then she tried annoyance, then she tried indifference, and each attempt landed wrong because paper does not respond to charm. She picked up the printed photo, held it for half a second, then put it down carefully, like she was afraid her fingerprints would become evidence too. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my ledger, the screenshots, the calendar PDF, and the receipt photo, and I saw the story forming a clean spine. It was not yet enough for public truth, but it was enough to confirm that Lena's lies were not isolated, they were structured. I also saw the shape of the next risk, because the more proof I held, the more likely she was to escalate her story about me. That is what people do when their lie starts to wobble. They do not confess, they attack the credibility of the person holding the facts. Before I turned off the lights, I checked the hallway table one last time and I noticed something new sitting near her keys, something small and branded, something that did not belong in our house. It was a thick paper wristband from an event venue, the kind you wear when you want access, and the name printed on it matched a vendor company tied to her charity gala planning. I did not touch it right away, because I wanted to think like a professional, not like a hurt husband. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I wrote one final line in my ledger, the line that made my pulse slow down in a very specific way. If she was bringing access bans home, then the affair was not just private, it was tied to her public image, and that meant the arena where she felt strongest might become the arena where she finally froze. The wristband sat on the hallway table like a loose thread on a clean suit, small enough to ignore, loud enough to unravel everything if you pulled it the right way. It was thick paper, branded with a vendor logo I recognized from Lena's gala planning packets, and it looked too new to be trash, too casual to be saved for real work. Lena had brought it home without thinking, which told me she had been living inside her second life long enough to treat the objects from it like normal household clutter. That is the thing about deception. It starts as a hidden room. Then it becomes an entire wing of the house, and eventually the liar forgets which door they used. I did not confront her with the wristband because I was no longer interested in verbal contests. If I held it up and asked what it was, she would give me a story, and the story would become a trap, because she would say it confidently and later claim I was harassing her for no reason. Instead, I treated it like any other evidence artifact that appeared in plain view. I took a photo of it where it was, beside her keys, with the date label I kept for my work notes. I did not move it first, and I did not touch it without documenting it, because I had learned that the easiest way to ruin the clarity of proof is to handle it like you are ashamed of it. I wrote the time down in my ledger, then I placed the wristband into a clear sleeve with a short, handwritten label and left it in my desk drawer, not hidden in some secret bunker, just stored the way an adult stores a document they may need. At work that day, my mind stayed annoyingly calm, and the calm annoyed me because it felt like a betrayal of my own feelings. Still, calm was the best armor I had. I reviewed files and listened to people explain why receipts did not matter, and every explanation sounded the same, and it made me think about how Lena's world was built on explanation. She was a charity director, which meant she could talk. She could speak in a smooth, grateful tone that made donors feel seen and made critics feel petty. She could frame herself as a victim while holding a full toolbox of control in her hands. She had built a social scaffolding that would catch her if she fell, and if I did not break that scaffolding cleanly, she would use it to swing back at me. Around noon, my cousin sent another message about Lena's vague post from the day before, and the comments under it were full of supportive lines and heart emojis, the kind of public sympathy people give when they want to feel moral without learning facts. The message from my cousin included one more detail that made the situation sharper. Someone had replied that Lena was so strong to keep showing up even when her home life was hard. That wording was not random. It was a seed, and I could see the field she was trying to plant. She wanted a story where she was the brave public servant, and I was the private problem, the husband who did not understand her mission and made her life harder. That kind of narrative is useful for two reasons. It gains her allies, and it makes my future evidence look like revenge instead of documentation. When I got home, Lena was on the phone in the living room, speaking in her warm donor voice, the one she never used with me anymore. She ended the call when she saw me and smiled like nothing existed between us. She asked how my day was, then told me she had a meeting later with the vendor team again, because the gala schedule was tight. She said the vendor lead was being difficult, and she added a complaint about how men in business always tried to push women around. That comment was a tiny trap, because it dared me to react emotionally, and it dared me to sound sexist if I questioned her. I nodded and asked what time the meeting was. She said 8 again, with that same smooth certainty, and she said it might be at the hotel lobby because it was quiet and central. She had adjusted her lie to match my card alerts, which told me she knew I had noticed the charges, even if she did not know how much I had recorded. That was the moment I decided I needed a public anchor, something outside our home that I could confirm without spying. The hotel lobby was not her private device, and the front desk staff were not my friends, and a simple confirmation about payer name or time was not hacking. It was just a normal adult interaction. People confirm folios and charges every day. Still, I did not rush out that night because rushing was how you slip. I wanted one more day of pattern, one more clean cross-check, and then I would choose the moment carefully. Lena left the house at 7:45, dressed like someone who was going to be seen again, not like someone who was tired from volunteer work. I stayed home and kept the lights low because I did not want her to feel watched. At 9:54, the merchant alert hit my phone again. The same hotel lobby bar, a slightly different amount, and the time window matched the night before. I wrote it down, then I waited. Lena returned a little after 11, quiet, controlled, and mildly irritated that I was still awake in the kitchen. She asked why I kept staying up, and I said I had work cases on my mind. She rolled her eyes and said she was exhausted, and then she complained about the vendor lead again in a way that sounded rehearsed. She was building a character in the story, a villain vendor, a hard job, a husband who did not support her. It was theater with props, and I could see the structure clearly now. The next morning, I checked the shared calendar again, and the entry for the previous night had been edited. The title was no longer planning meet. Now it said vendor coordination, and she had added a location tag that mentioned the hotel by name. The edit was supposed to make her story feel legitimate, but it did the opposite, because it proved she was backfilling the record to match what she assumed I had seen. I exported the week view again as a PDF, because capturing edits is not illegal, it is common sense. I wrote the time down, because the timing of an edit is often more revealing than the content of the edit itself. People who are innocent do not retroactively clean their calendar like a crime scene. That afternoon, I did something else that felt small, but mattered. I created a one-page table on my laptop with 5 columns: date, time, stated reason, merchant alert, and evidence artifact. I kept the wording neutral because neutrality is hard to argue against. Under stated reason, I wrote Lena's cover stories exactly as she had said them, without sarcasm and without commentary. Under merchant alert, I wrote the hotel bar charges. Under evidence artifact, I referenced the screenshots and the calendar PDFs by file name and time. It took me 15 minutes to build, and when I was done, the chaos in my head had turned into a clean grid. I printed it at work the next day, signed the back, and slid it into my growing sleeve stack. A liar can attack your emotions, but a liar struggles to attack a table. Late that afternoon, I received a message from a sponsor liaison named Tessa, someone I had met briefly at a gala last year. The message was polite, but it carried a subtle edge. She asked if Lena was doing all right, because Lena had missed a sponsor check-in, and the donor team was starting to get nervous about communication gaps. I did not reply with drama. I simply said Lena was busy, and I was sure she would follow up. Then I paused and considered what the message implied. Lena's behavior was not only harming our marriage, it was starting to leak into her public duties, and when donors get nervous, they ask for accountability. Accountability is the enemy of secret routines. That night, Lena told me the vendor coordination meeting would be at the hotel again. She said it smoothly, like she wanted me to accept it as normal, and then she watched my face. I kept my face flat and asked one question, the simplest question in the world. I asked who the vendor lead was. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, then she gave me a first name only, as if last names were suddenly optional in professional life. I nodded and said I hoped the meeting went well. She left with that same controlled confidence, and as soon as the door closed, I felt something shift. The lies were tightening, the edits were increasing, and her social posts were preparing the audience. That meant my timeline was not just useful, it was necessary. At 10:03, the hotel bar alert hit again, and I recorded it. Then I did something I had avoided until now because it felt too close to confrontation. I put on my coat, drove to the hotel, and walked into the lobby like any other customer. The place was quiet, polished, and full of people who liked to look important while doing nothing. I stood near the front desk and waited until the clerk was free, and I asked a normal question in a normal tone. I said I had noticed charges from the lobby bar on my card, and I wanted to confirm the payer name attached to the tab at that time window, because I needed to verify for my budgeting records. I did not mention Lena. I did not accuse anyone. I asked about my card and my account, which was my right. The clerk checked a screen, asked for the last 4 digits, then gave me a simple answer, spoken without interest, because for the clerk it was not drama, it was Tuesday. The payer name was not Lena. It was Grant Hale. I thanked the clerk and left without looking around because I did not need to see Lena in the act to know what the act was. The only thing I needed was that name anchored to my card alerts by a neutral staff confirmation. In my car, I opened my notes and wrote the time, the clerk's confirmation, and the name. My hands were steady, and my stomach felt hollow, and I realized the story had crossed a line. It was no longer only about her betrayal in private. It was about her using my life as fuel for someone else's nights, while she built a public narrative to protect herself from the fallout. When I got home, the kitchen was dark, and the house felt like a stage after the actors leave. I set my keys down, opened the drawer where the sleeves were stacked, and slid in a new page. On it, I wrote one clean sentence. Hotel clerk confirmed payer name for lobby bar tab, Grant Hale, time window matched alerts. I signed it, because signatures matter when someone tries to claim you invented everything. Then I turned off the light and waited for Lena to come home, not because I wanted a fight, but because I wanted to watch how she handled the first real crack in her scaffolding. And when she finally stepped through the door after midnight, her smile was there, but her eyes were searching the room like she expected to find something she had lost. Lena came in with the careful quiet of someone who expects a sleeping house, and the second she saw me sitting at the kitchen table, she adjusted her face like a person tightening a tie. The smile arrived first, then the tired eyes, then the small sigh that was meant to sound like sacrifice. She asked why I was still awake, and I said I had been thinking about work and budgets because budgets were a safe word in our house, a topic that sounded dull enough to end questions. Lena nodded as if she approved of my boringness, then moved toward the sink, washed her hands too long, and avoided looking at my phone on the table. Her body was relaxed, but her attention was sharp, and I could feel her scanning the room for evidence the way a careful liar scans a witness's face. I did not mention the hotel clerk, and I did not mention the name Grant Hale, because I was still treating this like a case, not a brawl. If I threw the name at her now, she would have time to build a defense, and Lena did not need much time to build a defense. She had a public voice, a public mission, and a circle of people trained to defend her on instinct. In her world, feeling matters more than fact, and a confident story told with soft eyes can drown a spreadsheet. I had no interest in giving her a rehearsal opportunity. I wanted her to keep performing the lie while I kept recording the truth, because that was how you win against someone who thinks performance equals reality. She went upstairs, and I stayed at the kitchen table until the house settled into silence again. Then I opened my desk drawer, pulled out the clear sleeve stack, and reviewed what I had without letting myself spiral. The evidence was still household level, still clean, still lawful. Merchant alerts on my card, a receipt strip found in recycling, screenshots of notification previews captured on a shared device, exported calendar week views saved as PDFs, and now a neutral staff confirmation that tied the payer name to the same place and time. It was enough to prove something serious, but not enough yet to force consequences in her public world. Consequences require witnesses, and witnesses require a stage where Lena cannot control the lighting. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened, because that is what people do when they believe they have mastered their own plot. She made breakfast and talked about the charity gala as if it was the only real thing in her life. She mentioned vendor coordination again, and she added a detail about how hard it was to keep everyone aligned. She said it with a tone that implied she was carrying the whole city on her back. I watched her hands as she poured coffee, watched the way her fingers hovered over her phone, and watched the way her eyes flicked to my face whenever she dropped a new excuse. She was testing what I knew, and she was listening for the shape of my reaction. I stayed flat and said I hoped things smoothed out soon. She leaned across the counter to kiss my cheek, and her gaze darted toward my phone again, quick and hungry, as if she expected to see the word hotel flash on my screen. That tiny check told me she had noticed the merchant alerts at least once, and it told me she believed I could be managed if she stayed a step ahead. The problem for her was that she was trying to stay a step ahead of timestamps, and timestamps do not get tired. That afternoon, my cousin invited us to a family dinner at Ruth's house, framed as a small gathering to catch up before the gala week got too hectic. Lena agreed quickly, too quickly, and I understood why the moment she said yes. She wanted the room. She wanted the family witnesses. She wanted a setting where she could appear exhausted and devoted and stable, while I looked like the husband with concerns. If she could get Ruth to treat my suspicion as disrespect, she could turn my evidence into a marital issue instead of a professional breach. I accepted the invitation with the same neutral tone I used when someone tried to bait me into a fight at work, because refusing would look like guilt and attending would look like normalcy. Normalcy was my best disguise. Before we left for the dinner, I opened the shared calendar again and looked at the week as a whole, not searching for a lover, but searching for continuity gaps. Lena had added and edited entries again, and the edits clustered around nights with hotel bar charges. I exported the week view as a PDF at 4:12 p.m., saved it, and wrote the time in my ledger. Then I printed the PDF and signed the back, not because signatures are magical, but because signatures prove that a document existed in a specific form at a specific time. When someone tries to rewrite history, you do not argue with them. You show them the time-stamped artifact and let silence do the work. At Ruth's house, Lena turned the charm on like a light switch. She hugged Ruth, complimented the meal, and spoke about the gala in a bright tone that made it sound like the whole event depended on her soul. Ruth responded the way Ruth always did, proud of Lena's public role and proud of what it made the family look like. Ruth liked stability and reputation, and Lena had learned how to feed both. I shook hands, smiled, and played the polite son-in-law because I was not there to start a war at a dinner table. Still, I watched the room carefully, because family dinners are where people reveal what story they have already been told. Halfway through the meal, Ruth asked how things were going at home, and the question landed with a softness that felt planned. Lena answered immediately before I could speak, and she described herself as busy and stressed, but grateful for support. She mentioned boundaries and pressure, and she said it in a way that made it sound like her home life was another responsibility she was managing with grace. Ruth nodded and gave me a look that was half concern and half warning, like she wanted me to behave. That look told me Lena had already planted something in Ruth's mind, something vague enough to avoid lies, but sharp enough to frame me as a potential problem. I did not accuse. I did not rant. I asked one clean question in a calm tone, the kind of question that sounds like logistics and not like jealousy. I asked how Lena's vendor meetings were going, and I asked it as if I was simply interested in her work. Lena smiled and said they were fine, then added that the vendor lead had been difficult, and that it was all normal event stress. Ruth glanced at Lena with sympathy, then glanced at me with mild impatience, as if I was supposed to stop asking anything that could make Lena feel scrutinized. I nodded and kept my voice even. I said I had noticed charges on our shared card from the hotel lobby bar during the same windows as those meetings, and I said I was trying to understand the expenses so I could keep our budget clean before the gala. I did not say a fare. I did not say betrayal. I said charges, time windows, and budget, because facts can enter a room without setting off alarms if you carry them like paperwork instead of bullets. Lena's fork paused for a fraction of a second. Her smile stayed, but the skin around it tightened, and her eyes narrowed in the smallest way. She answered quickly, saying the vendor team had ordered drinks while discussing logistics, and that the hotel had billed in a confusing way, and that she would clear it up. It was a smooth answer, too smooth, and I noticed she avoided one detail that mattered. She avoided naming who paid. People who are telling the truth do not fear names. People who are lying treat names like landmines. Ruth asked if it was really that big of a deal, and her tone carried a hidden message: do not make a scene. Lena's shoulders softened in relief, and she turned slightly toward Ruth, as if Ruth's approval was a shield she could step behind. That movement made me decide the next step right there, at the table, without raising my voice. I said I had already confirmed the payer name attached to the lobby bar tab because the card was mine, and I needed the record clean. I said the name was Grant Hale. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a polite story suddenly has an extra fact in it. Lena did not move for a moment, and the performance slipped just enough to show what was underneath. Her eyes widened slightly, then sharpened, then dropped to her plate, as if she could hide from the name by looking away. Ruth's face changed too, not into rage, but into confusion and discomfort, because confusion is what happens when a parent realizes the child they defend may have been playing them. Lena recovered fast, because recovery is her best skill. She said Grant was a vendor contact involved with the gala, and that vendor billing could be messy. She said it could be an administrative mix-up, and she said it in a tone that made it sound boring. But she was speaking too quickly now, stacking explanations, adding texture, and trying to outpace the simple weight of the name. I did not argue. I simply asked why she had never mentioned Grant by name before, and why she had described those meetings as volunteer planning if they were vendor sessions at the hotel bar. Lena's answer shifted again, and I could hear the gears turning. She said she simplified things because I would not care about vendor details. She said she did not want to burden me. She said she was trying to protect me from stress. Each sentence sounded like kindness, but each sentence was built on the assumption that I was too passive to verify anything. Ruth listened, then looked at me as if she wanted me to accept the explanation so dinner could return to normal. Ruth hated conflict more than she hated lies, and Lena knew it. I stayed calm and said I had exported our shared calendar week view as a PDF earlier because I wanted to keep our schedule aligned. I said the entries had been edited after the charges appeared, and I said it without insult, like it was a clerical curiosity. Lena's eyes flashed, and for the first time that night, I saw something like fear in her posture. Not fear of being yelled at, but fear of paper, fear of record, fear of the kind of truth that does not need persuasion. Ruth set her fork down and asked what was really going on, and the question sounded smaller than it was. Lena tried to answer with more framing, more stress talk, more hints that I was being controlling. But the name was sitting on the table now, and names have a way of turning vague stories into specific problems. I did not declare anything. I did not demand confession. I simply said I was collecting facts, because I would not be manipulated by half-truths, and because I refused to be painted as unstable when the record was clear. On the drive home, Lena was quiet in the passenger seat, and the quiet was not peace. It was calculation. She stared out the window, jaw tight, phone in her hand, screen angled away. I kept my hand steady on the wheel and kept my eyes forward, because I had no interest in a car argument that could become her next victim story. In my mind, I replayed the dinner moment and understood the real shift. This was no longer only about an affair hidden in shadows. Grant Hale was tied to the gala vendor ecosystem, which meant the betrayal was sitting inside Lena's public image project. The lover was not just a man, he was a contracted risk. When we got home, Lena went straight upstairs and shut the bedroom door harder than necessary. I stayed downstairs and opened my ledger because the ledger did not care about slammed doors. I wrote the dinner sequence as a timeline, including Ruth's presence, the questions asked, and Lena's cover story shifts. I noted the moment her calendar edits became relevant, and I noted the moment the payer name landed in the room. Then I added one final line, the line that made the entire situation feel sharper and more dangerous. If her affair was tied to gala vendors, then her consequences would not be private, and if her consequences were not private, then her next move would be to destroy my credibility before I could place the record in front of witnesses who mattered. The morning after the family dinner felt like walking into a room that had been rearranged while I slept. The same furniture, the same walls, but a different set of angles meant to make you lose your balance. Lena moved through the house quietly, not sulking, not apologizing, just tight and efficient, like she was already filing the night away under something that would protect her later. She made coffee, checked her phone, and avoided looking at me for longer than a second at a time. The avoidance was not shame, it was strategy. If she did not acknowledge the name I had placed on the table, she could pretend it was just noise, a minor misunderstanding that a stressed husband had inflated. I did not chase her into conversation, because conversation was where she had the advantage. Lena could make any exchange feel like an emotional ambush, then leave the room and tell others she had survived it. Instead, I kept my tone neutral and my movements ordinary. I cleaned the kitchen, checked my work emails, and watched her test the atmosphere with small actions. She left her phone face down more often. She stepped outside to take calls. She stayed busy in ways that kept her from being cornered by a simple question. I could almost see the decision forming behind her eyes, the decision to stop treating me as a partner and start treating me as a risk. By late morning, the first signs of her counterattack arrived the way they always do in social worlds like hers, not as a direct accusation, but as soft framing. A mutual friend messaged me asking if everything was okay, because Lena seemed overwhelmed and had mentioned needing support. The message read like kindness, but I could hear the subtext clearly. Lena was building an audience that would already believe she was under pressure at home, which meant any evidence I brought forward later could be painted as cruelty toward an exhausted public servant. I replied with a polite line about work being busy for both of us, and I kept it short, because the less you say during a narrative war, the fewer words can be used against you. That afternoon, Lena did something that confirmed my suspicion about her strategy more than any hotel charge ever could. She suggested we talk to a therapist, not with warmth, not with a desire to heal, but with the calm certainty of someone offering a solution that doubles as a weapon. She framed it as concern for our communication and stress levels, and she implied, gently but clearly, that my questions came from anxiety. She did not say it harshly. She said it in the tone that makes other people nod before they know what they agreed to. I did not refuse, because refusing would feed her narrative, but I did not accept in the way she wanted either. I said we could consider it and that timing mattered since her schedule was so packed. I watched her face as I said it, and I saw the flicker of frustration. She wanted me to argue. She wanted me to sound unstable. She wanted a moment she could retell. Instead, I kept moving like a man who had nothing to hide. I went to work, handled my files, and kept my mind on one clear objective. I needed one more confirmation outside the home that did not rely on devices or private spaces. Receipts were strong, screenshots were useful, and calendar exports showed pattern. But a neutral witness who could place her in a time and place without drama would be hard to dismiss. The advantage of neutral witnesses is that they do not care. They are not on your side or her side. They simply remember what happened because it was part of their day. That night, when Lena came home later than she claimed she would, I did not meet her at the door. I waited until the next day, when the building lobby was bright and normal and full of passing residents who barely noticed each other. Our building had a doorman, Owen Pike, the kind of man who saw everything and treated it all like weather. I greeted him the way I always did, asked how his shift was going, and made a small comment about late nights being rough when you are trying to keep a schedule. I did not mention Lena's name in a dramatic way. I did not ask him to spy. I simply asked, as casually as a person can, whether he had seen Lena come in around the time she claimed the previous night. Owen gave me a short answer with no emotion, because for him it was not scandal. It was a timestamp in his memory. He confirmed a late entry time that did not match Lena's story, and he added one small detail that made the confirmation more useful. He remembered she was not alone when she entered the lobby, because someone had held the door for her, and they had moved together like people who expected to be seen. He did not describe the person. He did not need to. The fact of accompaniment was enough. I thanked him and let the conversation end, because you do not turn a neutral witness into a participant. You take the sentence and you leave. In my car, I opened my notes and wrote Owen's name, the time of the conversation, and the one-sentence summary of what he observed. I did not inflate it. I did not add interpretation. I wrote it the way I would write any claim note in a professional file, because that style forces discipline. Then I printed the note later, signed the back, and added it to the clear sleeve stack. I could already hear Lena's future voice saying I was paranoid, that I was fixated, that I was tracking her. A single neutral sentence, recorded calmly, would not stop her from trying, but it would make the attempt less believable. Over the next few days, Lena tightened her routine in ways that confirmed she felt pressure. She stopped leaving loose receipts in the recycling. She stopped using the shared card as openly. She edited the shared calendar more often and with more polish. She began adding plausible details, like vendor names and meeting locations, but she added them after the fact, and the timing of those edits mattered more than the details themselves. Each time I noticed an edit, I exported the week view and saved it as a new PDF, labeled by date and time. I was not hoarding files to feel powerful. I was building a ladder of consistency that would let an outside observer step through the story without needing my emotions at all. Lena also escalated her public framing. She posted again about stress, gratitude, and boundaries, and the comments grew warmer and more protective. A sponsor liaison sent another polite message asking whether Lena had confirmed the final vendor list because there were concerns about communication gaps. I replied with a neutral line and nothing more, but I saved the message header in time because it showed that Lena's private chaos was already beginning to affect her public responsibilities. In her world, that kind of slip matters. Donors do not fund drama. They fund control. One evening, Lena tried a different angle. She invited me to attend a small pre-gala meet and greet, a casual gathering where donors and vendors would cross paths. The invitation sounded cooperative, but I could feel the trap. If I attended and stayed quiet, she would use my presence as proof that we were fine and that my concerns were imaginary. If I attended and asked a question, she would use it as proof that I was undermining her publicly. I agreed to attend because declining would look like fear, and fear would make her bolder. But I agreed on my terms, with a simple plan in mind. I would not confront. I would observe. I would collect only what was in plain sight, and I would leave before the room could become her stage. At the meet and greet, Lena moved through the crowd like she owned the air. She introduced people, smiled, and laughed at the right moments, and she never once looked like a woman hiding a second life. That was her skill, and it was why I had to be careful. She made secrecy look like leadership. I stood back and watched who orbited her most closely, and I noticed a man who seemed too comfortable near her, too familiar with her space. He spoke with her briefly, then drifted away when another donor approached. I did not chase him. I did not ask his name. I simply watched Lena's posture soften when she was near him, then tighten again when she remembered she was visible. That shift told me my clerk confirmation had not been a fluke. Grant Hale was not just a payer name. He was a presence in her public ecosystem. When we got home, Lena acted pleased, as if my quiet attendance proved something. She asked if I felt better after seeing how hard she worked. I told her it was a busy season and that I understood the demands. I did not argue because arguing would be the gift she wanted. Later, while she was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the evidence stack again, not obsessively, but methodically. Merchant alerts, receipt strip, shared device previews, calendar exports, hotel clerk payer confirmation, and now a neutral doorman sentence placing her late entry with company. The spine was firming up. The picture was becoming simple enough that anyone could understand it without me narrating. Still, I knew I was approaching the point where Lena would either confess or attack, and Lena did not strike me as a confessor. She struck me as someone who would rather burn a bridge than admit she lit the match. That meant I needed to move the proof from private awareness to an arena where her power did not come from charm, but from compliance. In other words, I needed her world's rules to do the work for me. 2 days later, an email arrived in my inbox from the charity board secretary, Mara Quinn, inviting me to a short administrative meeting about donor seating and vendor coordination, since I had attended the meet and greet and was listed as a household contact. The invite looked routine, but I could feel the opening it created. A board secretary lives in procedures, schedules, and recorded minutes. Procedures do not care about Lena's smile. I saved the email header, wrote the time down, and closed my laptop with a steadiness that surprised me. If Lena wanted to keep the war inside our home, she could control the rooms. If the war moved into documented meetings, she would have to fight paper with performance, and paper rarely loses. And as I heard Lena's shower turn off upstairs, I realized she had no idea that her own administrative machine had just handed me the door handle to the room where consequences could finally be recorded. Mara Quinn's email sat in my inbox like a polite invitation to a battlefield, written in neutral language, stamped with the kind of organizational routine that makes people feel safe. It referenced donor seating, vendor coordination, and household contacts, and it included a time and location for a short administrative meeting in the charity office lobby conference space. The message was not dramatic, and that was exactly why it mattered. Dramatic arenas belong to performers. Administrative arenas belong to records. I did not forward the email to Lena, and I did not ask her about it at dinner because I could already predict her reaction. She would either claim it was nothing and try to control my attendance, or she would claim it was intrusive and try to frame me as interfering. Either way, she would make it about emotion, and I needed it to stay about procedure. I replied directly to Mara, thanked her, confirmed I would attend, and kept my language short. Then I saved a PDF of the email chain with headers visible, because headers are proof that survives when people try to pretend conversations never happened. The day of the meeting, Lena left the house early, dressed sharply, hair pinned in the style she used when cameras might be nearby. She told me she had a vendor check-in and a donor call, and she said it in that practiced way where the words are technically plausible but emotionally empty. I wished her luck and stayed calm, because calm was now my only form of power. When she left, I took out my evidence sleeves and reviewed them one last time, not to rehearse a speech, but to check that each artifact stood on its own. I chose only the cleanest items, the ones that required the least interpretation. The hotel clerk payer confirmation tied to my card, the receipt strip photo with a date anchor, the shared calendar PDFs showing edits, and one shared device screenshot of a notification preview. I placed them in a folder, added a one-page table that aligned dates, places, and payments, and I labeled everything with simple file names and date notes. I told myself a rule again, because rules keep you from doing stupid things. I would show documentation only if asked. I would not perform. I would not accuse. I would not push for sympathy. At the charity office lobby, the environment felt like Lena's territory, But the meeting space did not belong to her personally. It belonged to the organization. A receptionist sat behind a desk. A few volunteers moved in and out carrying boxes, and the walls held framed photos of past events with smiling donors and branded banners. Mara stood near the conference room door with a clipboard, her expression polite and firm. She greeted me with the calm neutrality of someone who lives inside schedules and avoids gossip. She asked me to sign an attendance sheet, and I did, because paper trails work both ways. Lena was already inside the room, and the moment she saw me, her face tightened slightly before she forced a professional smile. The room was small, with a table, a whiteboard, and stacks of printed seating drafts. 2 other staff members were present, along with a sponsor liaison, Tessa Bloom, who looked like she had been awake too long. Lena introduced me as her husband, with a bright tone that felt like she was trying to claim normalcy out loud. I nodded and sat down without taking extra space. Mara began with routine items, donor preferences, seating flow, vendor load-in timing, and it all sounded like normal admin talk. Lena answered smoothly, confident, smiling at the right moments. If you watched her, you would think she had nothing to fear. If you listened closely, you could hear how carefully she avoided specifics. Then Mara moved to the vendor coordination line items, and I felt the room's air shift slightly. Mara asked about Grant Hale's team, because his company was listed as a major vendor partner for the gala. Lena's pen paused for a fraction of a second. Then she nodded and spoke about Grant's reliability, his flexibility, and his ability to handle last-minute changes. She said it like she was describing a tool, not a person. Tessa asked whether vendor expenses were still aligned with the budget projections, because there had been some unexpected charges, and the sponsor team needed clarity. Lena smiled and said everything was under control. She said it quickly, then glanced at me as if checking whether I would react. Mara, still neutral, asked a simple procedural question. She asked who was authorizing certain hospitality expenses at the hotel during planning windows, since the sponsor team had flagged repeated bar tabs tied to the gala vendor activity. Lena's smile held for a second too long. Then she said the tabs were part of necessary coordination meetings and that billing had been complicated by vendor staff rotations. The room stayed quiet, not hostile, just attentive, the way people get when they smell risk. Tessa asked if the organization had a clear record of who paid and who was reimbursed, because sponsors do not like confusion, and they like surprise even less. I said nothing yet. I kept my hands folded, eyes on Mara, posture calm. Lena tried to fill the silence with reassurance, but it sounded like she was spraying air freshener over smoke. Mara asked if there was documentation that clarified the payer name for those tabs, because she needed to close the budgeting line cleanly before board review. Lena said she could get it from the hotel later. She said it like it was easy. She said it like she had time. Mara turned toward me with a polite expression, because the meeting was about household contacts and shared budgeting logistics. She asked if I had noticed the charges on my card, and whether I had any record that could help them reconcile the line items. The question was procedural, not personal, and that mattered. It meant Lena could not easily frame my response as jealousy without making herself look evasive in front of her own staff. I nodded once and said I had confirmed the payer name with the hotel clerk, since the charges were on my card, and I needed to verify the record. I did not raise my voice. I did not add insults. I said I could provide a one-line confirmation note I had recorded with date and time. Lena's eyes flashed in a way she could not fully hide, and then she tried to recover with a laugh that landed flat. She said I had overreacted, and she said it as if she was gently correcting a nervous spouse. But Mara did not laugh. Mara asked if I had the confirmation in writing, because written records are how budgets survive audits and board reviews. I reached into my folder and pulled out the clear sleeve with the hotel confirmation note. I slid it across the table without flourish, just a page with a sentence, a time window, and the name, Grant Hale. I watched Lena's hand tighten around her pen. Tessa leaned forward, read the line, and her face changed from polite concern to focused discomfort. She asked Lena why a vendor partner's name was attached to bar tabs on my card, and why those tabs aligned with planning windows that were described as volunteer sessions. Lena started speaking quickly, and I could hear the defensive texture in her voice. She said Grant had offered to handle some costs to keep things smooth. She said it was normal in vendor relationships. She said it was all logistics. Mara asked a second question, still calm, still procedural. She asked why Lena had edited the shared calendar entries after those planning sessions occurred, changing labels and adding the hotel location, since that kind of retroactive change complicates reconciliation. Lena's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, because she had not expected the calendar to become a budgeting artifact. She said she had edited for clarity. She said she had been busy. She said she was trying to make the schedule readable for staff. I did not argue with her words. I took out the earlier exported calendar PDF, the one saved before the edits, and I placed it next to the later PDF, the one after edits. I did not give a speech. I simply aligned the two pages and let the differences show. The room got quieter, because silence is what happens when people realize they are holding two versions of the same story. Mara asked to photocopy the pages for the meeting file, because they related to budgeting and vendor oversight. She spoke like it was normal, because for her it was. Lena tried to object, saying it was a private marital matter. Mara calmly responded that anything tied to vendor expense reconciliation and sponsor confidence was not private. That was the first visible crack in Lena's public armor, because she had built her power on controlling what was considered public and what was considered private. Now her own processes were redefining the boundary, and she was losing control of the definition. Tessa said the sponsor team needed immediate clarity because repeated hospitality tabs and inconsistent records create reputational risk. She said sponsors might withdraw if the story looked messy. Lena's face tightened again, and the room felt like it had become smaller around her. Lena turned to me with a look that tried to be warning and charming at once, and she said we could talk about it at home. She said it in a tone that implied I was being cruel for bringing it here. I kept my voice flat and said I was not discussing anything privately that affected recorded budgets and vendor ethics. I said the record was the record. I watched Mara's expression remain neutral, and I realized she had made a quiet decision. She was not here to protect Lena. She was here to protect the organization. Mara said she would log the documentation in the administrative file and recommend a brief review meeting with the board chair and sponsor liaison. She said it with the calm certainty of someone who had typed the words "evidence received" 100 times in her life. Lena tried to redirect, but she was outnumbered by procedure. The meeting ended without shouting, because shouting was not needed. The room had seen enough, and the paper had done the work. When I walked out into the lobby, Lena followed me, her voice low, her expression tight. She said I was humiliating her, destroying her work, and punishing her for being busy. She said it fast, as if speed could create truth. I did not argue. I told her we could speak in mediation or in a civil setting, not in the hallway, not in private, not under her rules. She stared at me as if I had become a stranger. Then she walked away with her phone already in her hand, already drafting the next move. I sat in my car and wrote one line in my ledger, because the ledger was still my anchor. Charity office meeting, documentation entered into admin file, sponsor liaison concerned, review recommended. Then I looked at the time and realized something Lena would not like. The war had left our kitchen table and entered a room with minutes. And once minutes exist, performances have a harder time surviving. 2 days after the charity office meeting, the atmosphere in our house changed from tense to weaponized. Lena stopped pretending we were simply strained and started behaving like I was a threat she needed to neutralize. She kept her phone on her body at all times, even when she moved from room to room. and she began taking calls outside, pacing the driveway like a person rehearsing arguments for an invisible jury. When she did speak to me, her tone was careful and oddly formal, as if she was collecting phrases she could later repeat to someone else. The shift was not subtle. It was the difference between a liar trying to keep a secret and a liar trying to survive exposure. That same morning, I received a message from Ruth asking if we could talk. The request was polite, but I could feel Lena behind it, like a hand pressed through a curtain. Ruth did not usually ask for talks. Ruth issued expectations. I told her I was available later in the week and kept the reply brief. I was not going to fight Lena through her mother, and I was not going to deliver my evidence as gossip. Evidence belongs in records, not in family group chats. At work, my concentration slipped more than I wanted to admit. I kept replaying Mara's calm voice, the way she had treated the documentation like a budget issue and not a marriage issue. That was the turning point Lena could not control because it made the organization's interests separate from her personal story. Still, I understood Lena well enough to know she would not accept a procedural defeat quietly. She would escalate, and her escalation would not be based on facts. It would be based on framing. If she could convince the right people that I was unstable or vindictive, she could dilute the impact of my documentation and turn the review into a sympathy conversation instead of an ethics conversation. That afternoon, Mara sent a follow-up email noting a short board review session had been scheduled to address sponsor concerns and vendor reconciliation. The location was the charity conference room, and the time was early evening. The email included basic agenda points and a reminder that minutes would be recorded. I saved the email header, printed it, and signed the back, because I had learned the hard way that paper is not only evidence, it is protection. If Lena tried to claim I ambushed the organization or forced myself into meetings, the invite proved I was there because procedure allowed it. When I got home, Lena was already dressed, makeup done, hair pinned, and her expression held the brittle calm of a person about to walk into a hearing, not a meeting. She said she had to go to the office early for prep. She did not ask whether I planned to attend. She simply assumed I would stay home and let her control the room. I told her I had been invited and I would attend as scheduled. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she said that I was making things harder for everyone. She said it like a moral accusation, as if facts were my selfish hobby. I told her the sponsor team had concerns and I was cooperating with the process. Then I walked past her and went to wash my hands, because I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pulse. At the charity office, the room was more formal than before. The chairs were arranged with intention, a small stack of agendas sat near the entrance, and a board chair I had not met before stood near the window, speaking in a low voice with Tessa. Mara sat at one end of the table with a laptop, ready to type, and her expression suggested she expected a clean meeting, not a theatrical one. Lena sat upright, posture perfect, hands folded, the image of calm leadership. I noticed she had placed a folder in front of herself, thicker than the meeting required. It looked like armor. The board chair opened with the sponsor concerns, the repeated hospitality tabs, the inconsistent vendor notes, and the reputational risk. Lena nodded at the right points and offered explanations that sounded organized, but her wording was still slippery. She kept referring to coordination complexity, vendor dynamics, and stress, the kind of language that sounds professional while saying almost nothing. Tessa asked for clarity on payer identity and reimbursement because sponsors do not fund mysteries. Mara asked procedural questions about who authorized what and when and how it was documented. Each question was calm. Each question tightened the room around Lena. When Mara referenced the documentation I had provided earlier, Lena's jaw tightened. She tried to reframe it again as a private marital issue, suggesting I had personal motives. The board chair did not react emotionally, which surprised Lena. The chair asked a simple question, whether the documents were accurate, and whether Lena disputed the dates and names contained in them. Lena hesitated, then said she did not dispute the hotel existed as a meeting location, but argued that the interpretation was unfair. The chair asked again, narrower this time, whether Lena disputed that Grant Hale's name was attached to the tabs tied to my card. Lena tried to dance around it, then finally admitted the name appeared, but insisted it did not mean what people assumed. I watched the board chair's expression shift from uncertainty to fatigue, the look of someone who hates messy stories. The chair asked for the vendor contract file and any conflict of interest disclosures. Lena's folder opened, and she began pulling out documents quickly, as if speed could create control. Mara asked for specific items: vendor authorization notes, meeting logs, reimbursement approvals, and any written communications that supported Lena's explanation. Lena produced some emails, but they were vague and timed late, and the messages read like after-the-fact justification rather than real planning. The board chair asked why sponsor questions were being answered with soft language instead of clean proof. That question landed harder than any insult, because it was the kind of question Lena could not charm her way out of. Then Lena made a mistake I had been waiting for, the mistake that happens when a performer feels cornered. She tried to shift the room's attention from the documents to me by implying I had been monitoring her movements and creating a hostile environment at home. She suggested I had become controlling, that I was fixated, and that my behavior should be considered when evaluating the credibility of what I brought. She did not use those exact words as accusations, but she laid them down like stepping stones for others to walk across. I could see what she was doing. She was trying to turn the meeting into a judgment of my character instead of a review of her records. The board chair stopped her and said the meeting was about organizational risk, not marital feelings. The chair asked Mara to keep the minutes focused on vendor reconciliation and sponsor confidence. Mara typed steadily, and I could tell that Lena realized the room would not become her stage. That realization changed her posture. The calm began to crack, not into anger, but into impatience. She demanded a short recess, framed as needing time to retrieve a missing file and make a call to the vendor team. The board chair agreed, and people stood, stretched, and spoke in low voices. During the recess, I stayed in my seat and watched Lena step into the hallway with her phone. Her voice rose slightly, then lowered, then rose again, the rhythm of someone trying to control a situation that refuses to be controlled. I did not follow her. I did not try to hear her call. I simply watched Mara, because Mara was the real lever in the room. Mara was the person who made things real by typing them into minutes. Lena could lie to a crowd, but she could not easily lie to a typed record that had a date, a time, and a board chair's oversight. When the meeting resumed, the board chair asked for the vendor conflict of interest disclosure again. Lena returned with a printed page that looked rushed, as if she had just pulled it from a printer. The chair examined it, then asked why the disclosure was dated that day instead of earlier, given the planning meetings had occurred weeks ago. Lena said she had been busy and had intended to file it sooner. The chair asked why she had not. Lena said she did not believe it was necessary. The chair asked calmly whether Lena had personal involvement with the vendor lead beyond professional coordination. Lena's eyes flashed. She said the question was inappropriate. The chair did not argue. The chair simply stated that sponsors were concerned and the organization had to protect itself. Tessa added that if the story looked like a personal relationship affecting vendor decisions, sponsor confidence could drop overnight. Lena tried to insist that Grant was simply a vendor contact who helped coordinate quickly. Mara, still neutral, asked if Lena could provide any clean written record that showed meetings were strictly professional. Lena produced a message chain printed from somewhere, but the print looked like it lacked headers and context, and it did not resolve the payer issue. The board chair asked for records that could be independently verified. Lena had none that beat the simplest artifacts I had already provided: payer name confirmation, time-stamped charges, Retroactive calendar edits. The board chair then did something that shifted the entire meeting from concern to consequence. The chair proposed a temporary freeze on Lena's unilateral authority over vendor coordination until a review concluded, meaning vendor approvals would require board oversight. It was not a dramatic punishment. It was a procedural safety measure. But to Lena, it was humiliation, because it meant her power was being limited in front of people who mattered. Lena's face went stiff. She tried to argue that the freeze would harm the gala. Tessa replied that sponsors were already discussing withdrawal if governance looked weak. The chair asked Mara to record the proposed safety measure in the minutes. This was the moment Lena's eyes darted toward me, and I saw the cold calculation return. She could not win this room with charm. She would try to win the outside world with a story. She would make herself the victim of a controlling husband who sabotaged her work. She would aim her narrative at donors, friends, and family, hoping public sympathy could pressure the board. That was her playbook. And I realized something else, something sharper. If the board restricted her authority, she might choose a more radical exit than accountability. People who fear consequences often choose movement over repair. The meeting ended with the board chair scheduling a follow-up review and directing Mara to collect all relevant documents into an administrative file. Mara stated, in a flat, procedural tone, that the evidence had been received and would be attached to the minutes. Those words were small, but they were a blade. Lena gathered her folder with careful hands, stood, and thanked everyone with a voice that sounded practiced and hollow. Then she walked out without looking at me. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and wrote a single line in my ledger. Board proposed authority freeze. Sponsor concerned. Minutes will reflect evidence received. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. Because I knew what Lena would do next. She would not confess. She would not negotiate. She would try to erase my credibility and relocate the story to a place where she could control it again. And when I got home later that night, the house was too quiet, and Lena's suitcase was not in the closet where it belonged. The empty closet space hit me harder than it should have, because it was not just a missing suitcase, it was a decision made without me. Lena had not left in a hurry. She had chosen what to take, what to leave, and what story to start telling the moment she closed the door behind her. Her favorite coat was gone, the one she wore for photos, and the good shoes were missing too. The bathroom counter was cleared of her makeup, and the hallway table was stripped of the small clutter that used to mark her presence like a trail. It looked clean in a way that felt hostile, like she had sanitized herself out of my life so she could claim she escaped something. My first instinct was to call her, not to beg, not to yell, but to get confirmation of what was already obvious. I stopped myself because calls create audio, and audio can be edited in memory even when the recording is clean. If Lena wanted a narrative where I was unstable, my urgency would become her proof. I texted a single neutral line asking if she was safe and where she would be staying tonight. I kept it plain, because plain words are harder to twist. Then I set my phone down and waited. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a reply that looked like it had been drafted by someone who enjoyed paperwork. She said she needed space, she would be staying with a friend, and she asked me not to contact her except for practical matters. She added a line about feeling intimidated and overwhelmed by my behavior. The sentence was short, but it carried a specific purpose. It was not meant for me. It was meant for whoever she planned to show it to later. It was a seed for a story where she was cautious and I was the risk. I did not respond with emotion. I replied that I understood, and I asked for one practical detail, whether she planned to attend the gala and the board review follow-up as scheduled. She did not answer that question. She replied that her professional obligations were not my concern. That told me everything I needed to know. She was separating the spheres so she could claim I was invading one. If she could define my involvement as interference, she could make the board process feel like harassment. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my ledger again, because the ledger was the only place in my life that was not shifting under Lena's feet. I wrote down the time of her message, the specific phrasing about intimidation, and the fact that she refused to answer a simple scheduling question. Then I added a note I had been resisting because it made the situation feel final. Narrative escalation underway. Expect false framing to sponsors and family. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was panicking, but because my mind was mapping the likely next steps. Lena would call Ruth. Lena would call my cousin. Lena would call a few donors she trusted. She would explain the board review as an attack fueled by a jealous husband who could not handle her success. She would use soft words like boundaries and emotional safety. She would avoid specifics, because specifics would force her to collide with the record. Then she would try to buy time by creating noise, because noise is how people drown out minutes. The next morning, the noise arrived right on schedule. Ruth called me and asked if I had done something to scare Lena. Her tone carried judgment disguised as concern. I told her Lena was safe. She chose to leave after the board session, and I had not threatened her or raised my voice. Ruth asked why Lena was crying and saying she felt watched and controlled. I kept my voice calm and said I would not argue about feelings on the phone, but I would share factual records with a mediator or civil professional if needed. Ruth went quiet for a moment, then said she did not want this to become ugly. I told her it was already ugly, and the only way to keep it from becoming worse was to keep it factual. After the call, I saved the call log time on my phone with a screenshot, not because I wanted to litigate my life, but because I could feel the direction Lena was steering. When someone starts using fear language, they are preparing the ground for civil filings that change access and optics fast. I refused to be surprised. I took a second screenshot of Lena's text message about intimidation and stored it in my evidence folder, labeled with date and time. A person building a false narrative often forgets their earlier wording. I did not plan to forget. At noon, I received an email from Tessa Bloom. The subject line was neutral, but the tone was not. She said the sponsor team had received messages expressing concern about domestic instability affecting gala execution. Domestic instability. That was Lena's new phrase, translated into donor-friendly language. Tessa asked if I planned to attend the gala and whether there were any risks the sponsor team should anticipate. It was a careful email, written by someone trying not to accuse anyone while still protecting money. I replied in the simplest possible way. I said I would not cause any disruption. I would comply with any venue rules and any documentation I had already been logged through official channels. Then I saved the email header and printed it, because it proved Lena had already begun pushing her story into the sponsor bloodstream. The gala was in 4 days. That timeline mattered, because it meant Lena's consequences were no longer theoretical. The board had proposed restricting her authority, sponsors were nervous, and the event itself would be full of witnesses who cared about reputation more than truth. Lena's best move would be to control the stage at the gala before the record could catch up. She could introduce Grant as a key partner, wrap him in applause, and make their closeness look normal. She could present herself as the brave leader who kept going despite personal stress. She could even publicly thank people for supporting her boundaries, which would paint me as the reason boundaries were needed. If she won the room first, the minutes would feel like an afterthought. I drove to the charity office that afternoon and met Mara Quinn in the lobby, not as an enemy, not as a savior, but as the person holding the machine I needed. I did not corner her. I asked for 5 minutes and kept my request tight. I said sponsor messaging had started drifting into vague personal framing, and I wanted to ensure the administrative file remained clean and factual. Mara listened with the same neutral expression she always wore. She said the board chair had asked her to compile all vendor reconciliation documents and sponsor concerns into a packet for the follow-up review. She said the packet would be available for board members before the gala. That was the opening I needed, and I did not try to widen it into drama. I asked if the packet would include the earlier calendar exports and payer confirmation note. Mara said yes. I asked if the packet would be distributed in printed form for review in the meeting room. Mara said yes again. Then she added one detail that made my spine straighten. The board chair planned a brief pre-gala governance meeting in the ballroom's side room just before doors opened to confirm vendor oversight and sponsor confidence. The chair wanted to reassure sponsors face to face. In other words, the organization was bringing the record into the same building as the spectacle. I thanked Mara and left without smiling, because smiling felt like celebration, and I was not celebrating. I was preparing. That night, I returned home and found a certified mail slip in the mailbox, my name printed on it in block letters. It was not from the charity. It was from a law office. The slip meant a letter was waiting for me at the pickup counter, likely delivered that morning. Lena had not only left, she had started the civil process. She was moving fast, which meant she was afraid of something landing before she could frame it. The next morning, I picked up the letter and opened it in my car before I drove away. It was a formal notice requesting that I communicate through counsel, along with language that implied Lena felt unsafe and was seeking temporary civil boundaries. It did not accuse me of a crime. It did not claim violence. It used careful phrases that live in the gray area between feelings and legal optics. It was designed to make a judge cautious without giving a judge anything specific to verify. I sat in the car, read the letter twice, then placed it in a clear sleeve and wrote the date on the label. I took a photo of the certified mail receipt and saved it beside the letter scan, because if Lena wanted to play the game of civil pressure, I would play it on the only field where I felt comfortable. Documentation. I called a mediator's office and scheduled an appointment for the earliest available slot, because the best way to diffuse false fear language is to move the dispute into structured, recorded settings. I did not tell Lena I had done it. I did not threaten her with it. I simply booked the appointment and saved the confirmation email header. Then I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the evidence stack again, not as a husband, but as a man preparing to survive a story designed to erase him. The late twist of the week arrived that evening in the form of a single photo posted online. A donor had shared a throwback image from a pre-gala planning night at the hotel lounge, smiling faces under warm light. Lena was in the frame, angled toward a man whose hand rested too comfortably near her chair. The donor tagged the charity account, praised the team, and called the vendor partner by name. Grant Hale. The photo was public, and the date stamp was visible. Lena could deny feelings. She could deny intentions. She could not deny that she had allowed her affair to sit inside the charity's public brand space long enough for donors to treat it as normal. I saved the post-permalink screenshot, captured the tag and timestamp, and placed it into my folder without a single comment. Then I stared at the calendar. 4 days, until the gala. One pre-gala governance meeting in the ballroom side room, a board chair who hated mess, a sponsor team already nervous, and Lena now armed with a civil letter and a fear narrative, rushing to control the room before the record could speak. I turned off the kitchen light, locked the door, and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet house that no longer felt like a shared place. If Lena wanted to win with story, I would not fight her with louder story. I would do what I had done from the beginning, the only method that ever worked against a practiced liar. I would bring the smallest verified truths into the brightest room she could not control, and I would let the room decide what her smile was worth when it met paper. The day of the gala arrived with the kind of bright winter light that makes everything look clean, even when it is not, and I understood why Lena loved events like this. In a ballroom, everyone is dressed, everyone is smiling, and the noise covers the small cracks that would sound loud in a quiet kitchen. I left my house early with a folder that looked ordinary from the outside. The the kind of folder a spouse might bring to help with schedules, and I drove to the hotel with my hands steady on the wheel. I was not going there to interrupt her night, because interrupting would give her the story she wanted. I was going there to let the organization's own process speak in front of the people Lena needed most. The hotel lobby was already busy with staff and vendor carts, and the smell of polished floors and coffee drifted through the air like a warning. I checked in at the concierge desk as a household contact, not as an angry husband, and I followed the directions to the side room where the pre-gala governance meeting was scheduled. The side room was not glamorous. It was plain, functional, and shaped for minutes, not applause. When I entered, I saw Mara Quinn at a small table with her laptop open, cables neatly arranged, and a stack of clear sleeves laid out in a way that looked almost surgical. The board chair stood near the window speaking quietly with Tessa Bloom, and two other board members were present, faces set in that cautious professional expression people wear when money and reputation are both on the line. The first thing I noticed was the chairs. On every chair before anyone sat, there was an evidence packet, identical sleeves with small date labels, organized in the same order. No one had to ask for proof, and no one had to argue for attention. The room had been prepared for truth, the way a courtroom prepares for exhibits, quiet, consistent, and hard to ignore. I sat down without touching the packet yet, because the packet was not mine to perform with. The board chair began with a short statement about sponsor confidence, governance responsibility, and the need for clean vendor oversight before doors opened. The chair's tone was measured, not angry, and that tone made the room feel heavier than any shouting ever could. Lena arrived a few minutes late, dressed like the keynote speaker of her own life. She walked in with a smile that tried to fill the room, and she greeted everyone as if this was just another checklist item before the real event. When she saw the packets on the chairs, her expression shifted for a fraction of a second, then recovered. I could tell she had not expected the evidence to be physically present and uniformly distributed. A packet on every chair meant no one could claim they never saw it, and it meant the truth was no longer something she could isolate and negotiate privately. Grant Hale arrived with her, which was the cleanest possible confirmation of everything I had documented. He did not sit beside her at first, but he hovered near her shoulder with the casual comfort of a man who believed he belonged in her space. He wore vendor professionalism like a costume, and his eyes moved around the room as if he was gauging who held power. The board chair acknowledged him briefly and asked him to wait outside until invited, because the meeting was governance-focused. Grant hesitated, then complied, but the hesitation was enough. It showed he expected access by default. Lena sat down, opened her own folder, and began speaking before anyone asked her to. She framed the sponsor concerns as misunderstandings, the vendor tabs as normal hospitality, and the calendar edits as clerical cleanup. She used the same polished language she always used, and for a moment you could almost believe the story if you wanted comfort more than clarity. Then the board chair asked one narrow question, whether Lena disputed that Grant's name was attached to repeated hotel bar tabs tied to my card during planning windows. Lena tried to answer with context again, but the chair asked the same question in a simpler form, whether she disputed the payer name and the time alignment. Lena did not say yes or no quickly enough, and that delay mattered more than her eventual wording. Mara began typing, steady and quiet, and I heard the soft clicking of keys in the room, a sound Lena could not charm. Tessa stated that sponsor teams had been sent a public donor post showing Lena and Grant together in the hotel lounge during planning, and that the post had been tagged to the charity's public account. Tessa did not add emotions. She referenced the public timestamp and the vendor partner naming. Then she stated the sponsor team needed confidence that governance was intact and boundaries were enforced. Lena's eyes sharpened when she heard that, because public images are the one thing she could not privately negotiate away. A public post is a witness that does not get tired. The board chair instructed Mara to open the packet and confirm the sequence, because the meeting had one purpose: to decide the organization's next step before the ballroom filled. Mara, still neutral, walked the room through what was in the sleeves without drama. There was the payer confirmation note, tied to my card alert times. There was the receipt strip photo with a date anchor. There were the shared calendar exports showing retroactive edits clustered around the same windows. There was the shared device notification preview screenshot that used language inconsistent with professional planning. There was the public tag screenshot showing Lena and Grant together in the hotel lounge with a visible timestamp. None of it required trust in my feelings. It required only basic reading. Lena tried to pivot again, arguing that my involvement was personal and suggesting I had been creating pressure at home. The board chair stopped her and said the meeting was not about marital dynamics. The chair said sponsors were watching governance, not marriage, and governance required a clean boundary between vendor relationships and leadership decisions. Lena's posture stiffened, and I could see her trying to decide whether to fight the record or to attack the room. She chose attack. She looked at me and said, in a controlled tone, that she had requested that communication go through counsel and that she felt unsafe with my continued presence. She framed it as a boundary, but she framed it loudly enough that it would land as suspicion. The board chair responded calmly that civil boundaries between spouses did not override organizational governance and that the meeting was scheduled and documented. Then the chair asked Mara to type the phrase that Lena feared most, that the evidence had been received and would be attached to the governance file for immediate action. Mara typed it, and the room went quiet in a way that felt final. Lena's face held that tight smile again, but her hands moved restlessly on her folder like she wanted to rearrange the world with paper. The board chair then proposed the action Lena could not tolerate, a temporary suspension of her unilateral authority over vendor coordination and sponsor communications pending review, effective immediately. The chair proposed that the vendor contract with Grant's firm be paused until a conflict of interest review concluded, and that all vendor hospitality reimbursements be frozen until reconciled. These were not punishments in a dramatic sense. They were safety measures in a risk sense. But in Lena's world, safety measures feel like public disgrace. Tessa added that at least one sponsor had already signaled they would withdraw unless the charity demonstrated clear corrective action before doors opened. The board chair asked for a vote among the board members present because the timing demanded a decision now. Hands went up in a quiet sequence, and the vote passed. Mara typed the vote into the minutes in real time, including the date, the time, and the action taken. Lena stared at the laptop screen as if it had insulted her, because the record was no longer hypothetical. It was alive. The chair then asked Lena to acknowledge the temporary governance measures and to agree to comply without disruption during the gala. Lena tried to argue that this would ruin the event and make her look unstable. The chair replied that sponsors already felt unstable and that the only way to stabilize was to enforce policy. The chair then asked one final question, the kind of question that sounds simple but destroys rehearsal. The chair asked whether Grant Hale had attended planning sessions as a vendor only or as a personal partner, and asked Lena to answer on the record. Lena hesitated again, and the hesitation stretched long enough to become its own answer. In that silence, Grant appeared in the doorway, drawn by tension, and he tried to step inside. The board chair instructed him to remain outside and stated that vendor access to governance meetings was restricted. Grant tried to protest, but the chair gestured to hotel security staff stationed nearby for the event, and the staff asked Grant to wait in the corridor until vendor access was clarified. It was not a fight. It was a calm enforcement of boundaries, and that calm made Grant look smaller than he expected to look. Lena's eyes moved between the board chair, Mara's typing, and my face, and I could see the precise moment she realized the worst part. Her power had always come from controlling how things were told. Now the story was being told by minutes, by sponsor concerns, by public posts, and by documented inconsistencies that did not require her interpretation. She could still claim feelings, but feelings were no longer steering the consequences. Policy was. Mara printed a page, stamped it, received, and slid it into the packet, because this was how administrative truth becomes real. The board chair announced that the governance measures were effective immediately, and that a formal review meeting would follow within days. Then, the chair stated that Lena's role would be limited tonight to ceremonial hosting only, and that sponsor communications would be handled by the chair and liaison. Lena sat very still, because moving would have looked like disruption, and disruption would have made the record worse. I stood up without rushing, because rushing would look like triumph. I gathered my folder and nodded to Mara and the chair with the same restraint I used at work when a file finally closed. Lena looked up at me with a stare that was half hatred and half disbelief, as if she still could not accept that quiet documentation could beat her public polish. I did not speak to her in the room, because this room was not for marriage arguments. This room was for consequences. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard the ballroom doors begin to open, and the sound of people arriving swelled like an ocean behind a wall. The gala was starting, and Lena would have to walk into it knowing that her vendor partner was now a governance risk, her authority was now restricted, and her story no longer belonged to her. I paused near the corridor window and watched hotel staff roll a sponsor banner into place, perfectly aligned, perfectly clean, because optics always try to pretend nothing happened. Then I felt my phone vibrate once with a new message from Lena's counsel, reminding me of boundaries and warning me against interference. I did not reply. I simply saved the message, took a screenshot of the timestamp, and slid my phone back into my pocket. The record would handle the rest, because the record always does, and tonight it had already spoken in the only room that mattered before the music started.